right, so today I want to talk about the third essay that we're sort of gearing up to work on. Yep, right, right. You're trying to find one other source for whichever. So it could be about the subject, it could be about a certain type of justice. So it can be, any of those things. Like, let me show you. Let's see if I can do this. That would be the best, right? Because they're trying to have you. Well, it depends on what subject you're doing, right? So they want you to have like a data rich source of some sort, right? And that's what if you're doing the NFL, that's what they like in the beginning of this. It seems like they just were like everybody's doing the NFL, and so they're like, all right, so here's this study that exists and so on. So if you're not doing that, which many people are not, right? You want to find another sort of data rich source that has to do with your subject. But I also said it could also be useful to get a source that goes more in depth into the type of justice that you're going to deal with, right? So because that can also help. So either one of those will work. And I actually yeah. You're adding. So for in between the rough draft and the final draft, the idea is that you're like, okay, oh, here's what I need to help finish this paper off, whatever that is, like whatever source that is, right? So it may be that you find a data-rich source and you use it for the rough draft, and then you're like, okay, I'll go out and find a source that talks about whatever type of justice I'm going to use, and then you pull that in. Yeah, so the fourth source is trying to be like, all right, you've done it all, and you're locating sort of a weakness in your paper, and then you're trying to find something that will help you sort of shore that up. Does that make some sense? Let me see here. So in the folder for the week 8, I just put like moments ago, I just put a couple of links to extended explanations and definitions of the different types of justice. So that's you can use those or find those, but I was like, all right, because we have such a very very brief, clear, sort of concise definition of it, which is great. But also, if you wanted to sort of understand it better, so I try to find. I think most of them are encyclopedias of some sort, which are legit. But anyway, so those are those. Yeah. Oh yeah, totally. Yep, absolutely. Yeah. So those are the three. So I've tried to find three different places. One is, I think, a document actually that I found and put it in my own Google Drive. Just if you're not sure where the source comes from, you want to just let me know, and I can try to find out in case I linked you to something that doesn't have enough information on it. All right, so here's the deal with this essay, right? So it's justice and whatever your subject is slash the NFL's concussion study. So here's what's important. What's important is that you're trying to narrow your focus here. So you're talking about, I mean, obviously you have to have enough information to, write an essay, but you're trying to focus on a specific group or like specific participant in your situation, and then you're also trying to focus on a specific type of justice. So one of the things, and I just went through and made comments on people's discussion posts from week 7, I think is when I did that. And mostly just being like, okay, I see what you did here. And pretty much for everybody, I was like, okay, so what you want to do as you go forward is you want to be able to understand the relationship and the interests, I guess, of all the different participants in the situation, right? And then you're going to focus on one of them, and my suggestion is you want to focus on the one the group that's being harmed the most, right? Because justice has to do with trying to address some group or some person or some entity that has been harmed by others, right? So when you deliver justice, that's the theory of what that is, right? It's trying to make up for something. It's trying to right a wrong or whatever, and that means so many different things depending. But what in order to make your essay stronger or your argument stronger, you want to be able to have a pretty clear idea of like how all of the different participants connect to that issue, right? So what does the NFL, the actual league itself, have at stake in the situation of these players who may have concussions and may get super ill and die and so on? Like their interest, for example, is to have the players play as much as possible, and because that's where all their money making thing comes in. So that's sort of how they're into it. Fans are sort of like, yeah, well, I mean, fans aren't making any money from the NFL, right? I mean, unless you're, I don't know, related to somebody or you're actually playing in it. But fans generally don't, right? So, but what are they getting out of it? Oh, okay, so they're getting out of it this entertainment experience, right? This intense sort of, if you're an actual fan of some sort, they're getting this out of it. So, what do they want? They want to see like violent games, let's pretend, like people hitting each other hard and all of that. So what you're trying to do is identify each of the major participants in the actual situation and be able to figure out, okay, what is it that they put into it and what is it that they get out of it, right? Because you're trying to search for, which is not too hard, but you're trying to search for the group that is being harmed the most. So in the NFL example, it's pretty clear that the league is not really harmed by a bunch of people having concussions. The fans aren't really harmed, right? You end up with this idea that the players are the ones who are harmed. You also, have to deal with the fact that the players they have some idea of the risk that they're taking, right? So they have some idea. Of course, now they have a better idea, right? Because back in the day, they may have known about concussions a little bit, but this concept where it develops this like CTE disease where people, absolutely go mad and end up dying and so on. Anyways, so and this matters also in the other, a lot of people are doing the student debt one, and it's the same thing. So what you need to do is figure out, even if you're going to focus on, like, even though I'm going to focus on the players in the NFL, I need to identify and understand what each of the participants has at stake, like what they're putting into it and what they're getting out of it, right? So the NFL, they're putting in money and they're hoping to get money. Like literally, that's their whole deal, right? Owners are trying to develop talent to become successful. Basically that's their thing, knowing that also money will follow and whatever, but they're very interested in winning is their sort of deal. Fans are sort of interested in their team winning and also an interesting show and so on. So you want to be able to know all of that so that when you end up sort of focusing on one of the groups and a type of justice, you understand how that it relates to the other groups. And so you can sort of say, I mean, because if you identify these, at some point you can identify who's doing the harm, like who's doing the most harm, and then who is being harmed the most. Meaning, so then when you're talking about a type of justice, you can figure out, well, would it be better to shut down the NFL? Like that would be a very sort of punitive, retributive, punishment or type of justice. Like, well, that might not be the best idea, right? Even though it would do, something. Or you fine them money, but does that really even matter? So, anyway, you want to know where everybody stands in relationship to the problem or the issue at hand, and then you want to be able to sort of, figure out what you're going to talk about. Yeah, and Josh. Right. Okay. So no. So that's not it. That's exact. Here's what I want to make clear, because I know. I said what you want to do in the end is you're going to just pick one of them, right? So you're just going to talk about um, students or something. You're going to pick students as the group that you're going to focus on, and then you're going to focus on a certain type of justice. Okay, but when you're talking about students, like in your explanation of how the benefits and the harm and the situation that they're in, you also want to be aware of the other players, right? You want to be aware of the banks and what the banks have invested in the situation, and what college you want to be aware of that, so that when you're talking about your one group, because you really do want to focus it on one group, so you want to pick one, and then you want to talk about them and a certain type of justice. And what I'm saying is, in order to do that well, you still need to know about the other groups that are involved, so that you can talk about, okay, so here's what students have, here's the student situation, here's the student's perspective and what they have, and go on. But there's another perspective that's sort of going against them, and that might be whatever, the colleges who still need to make money, or the banks who still need to, like, have interest rates. Yeah, go ahead. I'm trying to think. Well, you're closer, but you really want to do students. Now let me see if I can hold on. Let me see. I got some examples. So the focus really wants to be about the students. Okay. So you're not going to divide your paper up into, you're not going to use the different groups. So you're not going to do what you were just saying, sort of like, here's about students, here's about government, here's about banks, here's about schools, or whatever. You're just going to stick with students. And what you're going to try to do with that is create sort of three main ideas about that group. And in your development, in your discussion of those three main ideas, you're going to probably end up inserting some information, right? So you're going to say um, that students, like, so my idea here, like, you're going to include information from other groups, but you're not going to focus on them, right? So you're going to say, so students are the most valuable group in this system, so they need to be protected. And in explaining why they're the most valuable group in this higher education thing, meaning, like, if you don't have students, you don't have anything, right? The whole thing breaks down. Nobody cares about anything. There's no loans, there's no colleges, whatever. So students are the most important. And so you talk about them and how they're being harmed, and then you can discuss, like, how the other things are contributing to that harm, right? So you can say banks are contributing to harming them by whatever, giving them these, loans, and then, but they'll never forgive the loans, and they're making interest rates until the end of time off of them, or whatever. Colleges continue to increase tuition, which is making students have to take out larger loans. And so you just want to be able to talk about the other ones in relationship to the group that you're choosing. So if you choose students, which is what the smart one to choose in my mind, right? Meaning the easiest, meaning they're the ones who are obviously most impacted by debt. But as you describe these, as you figure out what your main ideas are, you can mention the other ones, right? You can talk about how they are contributing to this. So students are the most valuable and the most necessary. My second idea will be, I'm going to talk about the student debt crisis and connect it to distributive justice, because I've decided that's the justice I'm going to deal with. As I talk about that, I can bring in the other groups, right, and talk about how they are contributing to the problem or contributing to the solution, maybe, who knows. But that's what I mean by, so, yeah, what needs to be clear is that you're not really doing the thing where you're not just breaking it down and being like, here are the groups and here's how they are related to this subject. Boom, boom, boom. Instead, you're like, here's this one group, and this one group needs justice. So you're trying to identify the group that needs justice. And you're trying to figure out, and you're going to talk about a certain type of justice, and then you're going to have three main ideas for that. You're going to say, here's one of the main ideas that has to do with students and distributive justice. Here's another main idea that has to do with students and distributive justice. And here's a third one. And in those, while you're developing them, you want to be able to talk about or point to the other groups. You want to be able to say, okay, here's what the deal is with students, but also colleges are making it more difficult because they're raising tuition and they make people take larger loans out and stuff like that. Yeah, go for it. Yes, exactly. And so that's why you have to bring in those other ones. So that's exactly it. So you bring in the other ones and you talk about the harm they're doing and they're participating, and then you talk about what the justice would look like, right? So if you're going to bring in distributive justice, here's what schools would have to do, here's what banks would have to do, here, right? So that's why you would bring them in. But that's a better, yes, I would say that's a much a clearer way to think about introduction. Students are the ones who are being harmed the most, and here's statistics that prove that. And then here are the things that are harming them, and then here's how a certain type of justice would fix it. And here's another way that might harm them, and like, so I would say yes, that's a much better sort of clarification, right? So they made these kind of questions, right, and they're based just on the NFL one, which I know like this time, which is interesting to me, right? I think last summer when I taught this, most everybody did it. Now most everybody's doing something about student debt, one of the student debt ones, which is interesting. In any event, so your essay is focused on justice and whatever your subject is. You want to be able to figure out the different groups that are involved and look at the different types of justices, right? That apply well or don't apply. In theory, you can apply every type of justice, but there are some that make more sense than others, right? Like, for example, if we decided to be like, okay, well, the students are in debt, we need to punish the banks, so let's shut them all down and put all their people in jail, right? That would be a nice punishment for them, but it would just be, it's not realistic, it doesn't work, it's not a thing that will help students even anyway. It's trying to get you to deal with the concepts of these three types of justices, right, and try to apply them. And then for the justice, right, here's the question they came up with for the justice as far as NFL goes. Like, how can we play and watch and pay for football in a way that is just for that person or group? So, like, they're looking for the best possible scenario, and then what type of justice gets people there. So, if we translate this into a different subject, right, it's like how can we get a college education, pay for the college education, and benefit from the college education in a way that's just for everybody, right? That would be, sort of synonymous. So you're trying to figure out those things, and because in the student debt problem, that's clearly the difficulty. Like, students are being harmed because they're ending up with this degree with questionable value, and then a debt that they're supposed to pay until the end of time, for especially if you're doing that one article. You're like, all right, so here's the kind of justice that would need to happen. And then you're trying to suggest how would this happen, right? So what needs to happen? What does the government need to do? What do banks need to do? What do colleges need to do? Like, everybody has some part of this, right? In general, if you're talking about justice, you're talking about a group of people who are being harmed, and there's not a lot that they can do. Usually, if you're in a group that's being harmed, you don't have a lot of like agency, right? You don't have a lot of ability to choose. So it's not like we could be like, okay, so what can students do to help relieve this debt crisis? Like, literally nothing, right? Like, the only thing they could do is just don't go to college, which defeats the whole purpose of the whole thing. So you look at the other groups. You're like, all right, what do schools do? Well, maybe they don't freaking jack up their tuition prices every single year, to buy buildings or have a sushi bar or whatever. What does the government do? Okay, so maybe it, creates loans that don't, or gives more grants out than loans, right? Things that don't have to be paid back, that can actually help people and so on. So you're trying to come up with, who would have to change and what they would have to change. Right, and then the qualitative evidence means you're finding at least some article or something that has statistics in it. And it's in my memory, I think the NFL one has, it's talking about an actual study that was done, right? That was sort of hidden or whatever. So in that case, the study itself is the evidence, right? It's the quantitative evidence. So, but you don't really have that. I'd have to check. You might want to check the other articles. I'll have to look too. Like, so, right? They give you student debt, and they give you a few articles about that. I think reparations is the other one. They give you a few. So one of those articles might be more of a quantitative. So it means like a study, right? You want to find something that's a study that has data about your subject. And some of those articles that they suggested have more statistical data than other ones. But so they just want to make sure that you're actually finding some piece of a study that has data in it, and you're using that, right? So you're not just dealing with articles that are commenting on a study. You're focusing on them, but also looking at the study itself. I think that's ultimately what their goal is. I'm gonna put that there too. Right. So very briefly, right? Retributive justice is basically punishment, right? So the idea is that by punishing somebody or something or some incident, whatever, like just pure punishment, that's going to actually help restore justice to some situation. And obviously, that's a very specific type of justice and just doesn't work for all situations. It's not enough just to, like, put someone in jail or fine somebody. You can do it, that's great, but it doesn't mean that that's going to restore any sort of balance, which is ultimately what justice is trying to do. And then corrective justice. So I think retributive we're most familiar with, right? Since we have the highest population of people in prison, America does, than anyone in the world. We're very familiar with the concept of punishment for doing something wrong. Like, that's a big one. Corrective is another one. There's compensation in corrective justice. So I think of it like a civil lawsuit, right? So retributive justice is a guy commits a crime and he steals all your stuff from your house. So he needs to go to jail. So that's a punishment for him. And that's sort of part of the thing that will help. But also, corrective justice means compensation, like meaning you get your money back for the things that were stolen, or you get your things back, or whatever. So those are the two that I think we're the most familiar with. Distributive justice is most interested in, like, how can everybody in this situation benefit? Meaning, how can we share the burdens and the benefits, right? So in the NFL world, these players are getting concussions and maybe having serious issues, and the NFL, the actual organization, the actual corporation, could care less. They just want their money from what they're making, right? So they're clearly not suffering any of they're not taking on any of the burdens, really, right? They're just benefiting. So they benefit, whereas you could make a case that the actual player is doing both things, right? He's taking on the burden, meaning he's taking on possible dangers to his health, but he's also benefiting because he's also making money. So he's sort of doing that. The question is, well, if you're engaged in an activity, that could kill you, it's hard to you're not really going to be able to benefit enough to make that worth it, in theory, at least for NFL. So anyway, distributive is the one that I think most people, at least what I've found, is that most people think it's the most, it's the most different type of justice, right? Meaning we're very familiar with punishment, prisons, corrective justice, suing people, and then distributive justice is a different way where you're trying to be like, all right, we're not here just to make one group whole, right? We're not here just to be like, here's a group, we're going to fix this group and give them a bunch of money. But we're here to distribute all of it, like the burdens and the benefits. So what can the NFL do to take on more of the burden of the players, right? So if every time, a player got a concussion or what, the NFL had to pay like $1 million into some fund, they would be way more interested in people who had concussions or not, right? Like they just would, because it's a money thing. So that would be them taking on more of the burden, as well as benefits. So anyway, that's what that's about. Distributive justice is trying to think of a way where, okay, we're going to set up a system here where every party involved, which is why I was stressing why you want to identify all of the parties, but every party involved has some sort of risk or burden, and then also has some sort of potential gain, and that would be distributive justice. And so it's the most I don't know, complex justice, at least in my mind, right? Because it's trying to do a little bit more than the other ones. Retributive is just being like, you are bad, go to jail. Corrective is like, you've been harmed, here's some money. Right? Distributive is like, all right, let's just look at the whole system here and try to even it out a little bit so that we have, gains or whatever. In the student debt world, colleges clearly gain. They're just gaining, right? People are taking out huge loans on themselves, but the loans are just going to the college, and the college is taking the money, and that's it, right? There's no burden for them. They're not taking on burden. They're just taking money. So all of the burden is on students. Yes. Well, you want to align it with this for sure, I think, but I don't think you're that far. I don't think yours is that different. Retributive clearly doesn't really care what happened. I think it's very like what you just said. Retributive is like, you did something, and so we're going to focus on the consequences of whatever you did, and we're going to punish you for it. That's it. You're right about that. They're not really taking into account the intentions, like you just said. Like they're not much interested in that. Meaning, because you stole from, you took everything from my house because, I don't know, you're trying to save me, from having too much stuff. I don't know, right? Like they don't care. You're going to jail for this certain amount of time. Distributive justice, I'm trying to think of how to, I sort of understand what you were saying. You're trying to, like, distributive justice does take that into account. Is that sort of what you mean? Like it's trying, okay, yeah, that might, no, I don't think that's incompatible with what we're saying, because I think it's, in order to do distributive justice, in order to look at a situation like the student debt and look at all the players involved in student debt and try to come up with a system where everybody benefits at a certain level and everybody takes on a burden at a certain level, you do have to look at what people are doing and why they're doing it, right? So like colleges at the moment are just taking money, right? They're just getting money, they're taking it, and that's it. So there's no real I don't know, mediating factor, right? Like there's no really like, oh, but there's no like, I guess like, oh, they need it to build, another building or whatever. So what I'm saying is I don't think your versions are that different. I'm just trying to like sort of shape them into it, right? Because distributive justice, right? That's actually a great example. I'm going to totally steal that and use that. Yes, right? Because, and so the idea is, right, you have some responsibility in this situation. You can't just be the ones who are like, well, where's our money? Although, as we've seen in actual real life, we bail out the banks and screw everybody who has debts. But yeah, no, you're totally right. I would say that's a great. So, right. So I would say I think I would not try to alter or change whatever you're thinking about, because I think that's a good way to think about it. That everybody involved in it, though, has a stake or has a risk or something. Same thing with colleges, right? I mean, colleges are taking the money. Like, shouldn't they be like a bank in a certain way, in the sense of, okay, we'll let you come here, and then like, oh, you can't pay tuition? Well, then we'll just kick you out. Like, well, hold on a second, right? You knew that I was not a millionaire when you let me into your school, right? You knew that I had debts and I had things like that. So you actually should be part of this equation. You don't just get to be like, well, we're cutting you off, sorry, good luck. You have to be like, no, you brought me into the system, so either you could lower it, you could defer my payment, you can figure out a way to help me out. Like, that's what your job is, as opposed to just being like, well, don't have the money, you're out. So that's good. It's a good way to think about what distributive justice is, because I think that's the one that's the most, like I said, it's the most complex and most difficult, right? And actually, I think it's probably the one that's most rarely pursued, right? Because it's way easier in real life to do one or the other of these things. Like, oh, somebody did something wrong, punish them. Oh, somebody did something wrong, give money to the people who were harmed or whatever. Like, that seems very straightforward. Distributive is trying to be like, let's change the system that we're in so that it's not so unequal and there's not just one person. I mean, for student debt at the moment, it's literally just like the students that you're done. Like, that's it. They're the only ones carrying the risk. They're the only ones who have the burden, and their ability to actually pay back the debt is not just up to them, right? You can pull on your bootstraps all day and to get a job, and if there are no jobs, or if you're living in a world where your unemployment rate is like 11-12% because everybody got laid off because of a pandemic. I'm just saying, right? There's circumstances that happen, and then other people need to be accountable and responsible for it and help, as opposed to just being like, well, we're kicking you out of school because you can't pay, or we're repossessing whatever you have because you can't pay, or whatever. Anyway, I think that was a great example that you gave on Josh. I think that helps. All right. So I tried to do. Did I try to do one for student debt here? It looks like it. Right. And in fact, right. So it's probably not a total secret, but you want to pick the group of people who are being harmed, no matter what your subject is, right? And then you want to find a type of justice that's going to help them. That's your first duty, is to help them, right? So if I find someone who's harmed, whoever, in whatever situation, my idea is, okay, I have to help them. Is punishing the person who did this, or the group, or the whatever institution that did this, is that the thing that's going to do it? Maybe, maybe not. Is giving them money going to do it? Maybe or maybe not. And then is maybe transforming a system so that people are more accountable going to do it? Maybe. So like in my example here, clearly I picked, right, so my example, student loan debt, and then I put the different groups. You got parents, you got schools, you got banks, you got government, you got students themselves, you got actual, I don't know what I meant by companies. It's tricky to know, but and then I'm like, all right, I'll pick distributive justice, and then I'm trying to move on from there. And one of the things I suggest for your thesis is to use this word while. So one of the ideas that I usually use in teaching is to use templates, just to help us direct our thinking, right? Doesn't mean you have to always use them, but it's a way to. So if you use the word while, it helps you sort of point out an idea and then sort of switch and explain a problem. You don't have to do it, but it's a good way to do that. So I have, while college students are somewhat aware of the financial commitment they make when they enroll in college, right? So I'm trying to actually say, look, yeah, I get it. Like, people aren't dumb. They know, right, that it costs money and they're taking loans, right? So I'm going to give you that. But while that's true, the principles of distributive justice reveal that the students are bearing more and more of the burden within the system of higher education and realizing fewer and fewer benefits, right? So the while statement, using, beginning with the word while, gives you the ability to point something out and then sort of show the problem. So like, while NFL players are aware of the physical toll that their job takes on their body, the ideas of corrective justice reveal that they don't really know all the information because people hide it from them and so on, and so that they can be putting themselves in serious danger or something. In any event, so that's my suggestion for coming up with a thesis, to come up with the a while statement. It gives you the ability to say, all right, yep, I'm going to give you this part of it because it's true, right? Because the argument would be, well, students shouldn't take loans, if they, shouldn't go to college if they can't pay for it or whatever. Like doesn't make any sense. They have some idea of it, but they just aren't given an incredible. Okay, and so then I'm trying to come up with my three main points. And I went over this already, right? So I'm trying to find three main ideas that I can develop that have to do with students and distributive justice, and sort of applying that, right? So in fact, I could even, and this might help me, I could even take on like the banks, right? My supporting idea could be something about like students and the banks, and then students and government, and students and the college, right? I could just break it up into the different things and discuss, all right, in the system of distributive justice, here's what happens with the banks and the students. Here's what the banks do, and here's what the students do. And then college, right? I can talk about what the college needs to expect and the risks that it needs to take on versus the students and so on. So that might be a simpler way, a clearer way to break it up into three main ideas. So you would want to think about that, I think, as I'm looking, because I didn't really do that here. I'm noticing, right? I'm basically just going to talk about how, I don't like this one. I want to change it. This is all terrible. Because I'm basically just constantly talking about how they're the most important group in the situation, and then they're taking on too much of the burden. So if revising this, I would come up with supporting ideas, topic sentences, right, that introduce distributive justice, students, and one of the other players. And then discuss sort of what they would need to do. Well, first I would be like, here's the situation, right? So banks just loan out money and put a rate on it, and if you pay or you default, and your credit, is just crappy, and the rest of your life is toast, right? So I talk about, and then so therefore, here's what the relationship between banks and students needs to look like if we follow distributive justice. If we use distributive justice as our sort of outline, here's how the relationship between banks and students looks. And then I move on and I go, here's what the relationship between government and students look like if we do distributive justice, and here's what colleges and students, what the relationship looks like. That might be, in my mind at the moment, that seems like that might be a better sort of approach than just trying to parse out different parts of the distributive justice. Okay. And the same thing, I would do the same thing with the NFL, to be honest. Right? I'd be like, and again, distributive justice is the one to pick, right? In my mind, like for this essay, that's the one that makes the most sense, because in any of these subjects, there are not many, but in any of them, there is no real satisfactory corrective justice or retributive justice, right? What if more than 4 people have concussions on your team, you put the coach in jail, right? It makes no sense. Like, that's not a thing to do. You might get away with money. You could probably do a theory of corrective justice, meaning like, I don't know, they're paid $1 million for every concussion they get. But that's not really going to help anybody, right? Just people have a lot of money and also be like brain dead. So anyway, in my mind, they give you these 3, but they mostly give you the 3 types of justice just to help you think about these different types and then focus on, in my mind, the distributive justice, because that's the one that's the most difficult, but it's also the one that has the potential to bring the most good to a situation, right? Because it's making the participants who don't have a stake in the situation, it's making them have some responsibility. That's all. And then it's also compensating people who are harmed. So anyway, that's my suggestion, would be distributive justice is the best one to pick because it gives you the most to say, which is sort of what we're looking for. Yeah. All right. Boom, boom, boom. The rest is just about like regular sentence stuff. I mean paragraphs. But I'd rather, if I do this, which I may have already gone over it, but I'd rather go over it when people have a rough draft going, right? Because then we can talk about paragraph development and how you do it and what it needs to look like and so on. All right, pasta. My two students. You wouldn't believe that there's 27 students. All right, I don't need to like take it personally. I don't. Of course I do. Anyway, I'm so glad you guys came. It's super worth it. Because then I, could talk, which obviously I clearly love to do for the love. All right. But that's all I got. So I'm going to put this up. I was taping the conversation, so I'll put that up. But I mean, you guys are both on it and thoughtful and all the good stuff. So you can always post questions for me or just email me. Either way. But I will post this in week 8 in the chat, and then so you just want to have some sort of draft going and submit the draft for Sunday, and that's it.
Thank you for your help.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for coming. I appreciate it. All right. Good night. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Good night.